Welcome to lesson 2 of module 7. And before we hop in and start talking about the Velo API for membership, I want to take a step back and talk about a JavaScript concept that we have come across a lot in our course so far without even knowing it. And that is JavaScript promises. And the reason I've held off with this so far is because promises is one of the not necessarily most complex aspects of JavaScript, but it is something that people tend to stumble over quite often, and I think it's best learned after you've already gained some experience with it. So what are JavaScript promises? JavaScript promises are a special object that represent an asynchronous action, or basically something that is taking time. So let me just hop in with an example, and I think that will help clarify things. So for our example, I'm going to be using Wix query, and I'm going to import Wix data right over here. So import Wix data. And we're going to build a very simple query. So I'm going to say Wix data dot query, and let's query one of our already existing collections. So let's say our mock data collection. And we're going to run find. And then after this, we've always been writing dot then result, and we have a callback function and dot catch result. Error and console dot log error. Right? And then here inside we can say console.log result.items. Okay, so this is a construct that you should be quite familiar with because we've been using it a lot so far. And if you feel confident using this, then that's awesome because you're using a promise. Okay, so this is one of the methods for resolving a promise. And wixdata.query.find is a promise. And why is this a promise? Because if you recall, what's going on here when we run a query is that we're essentially making a request to a server, which is going ahead and querying a database and finding information and sending it back to our website. And this process takes time. Okay, and we don't know exactly when we're going to get the results from our database, because maybe the server is slow today, maybe it's fast today, maybe there's a lot of data, maybe there's a little data. We might even not get back our data at all because there's some kind of error. So that is the typical situation where a promise is used. And behind the scenes, this line of code is built as a promise. So when we're using a promise, we can't treat it just like any other line of JavaScript code, but we have to resolve the promise and wait for that answer in a very specific way. So let me highlight this again in another way if it hasn't sunk in yet. If I was writing this as a regular line of JavaScript code, if it wasn't a promise, then instead of having these lines of code over here, I could just say const result equals wixdata.query mockdata.find. Okay, if this was a regular function, then this would return a certain result, and I could capture the result over here, and then I could write more code that deals with my result. So I could say console.log result, and then I would definitely get this result back, and I could log it because JavaScript happens one line after the other. But because this is a promise, basically, I don't know if I will have my result by the time I reach this line in the code. So that means that when I do console.log result, it could be that I won't actually have my result yet, and then I won't be logging the right thing. And then if I try to use that variable later on in the code, then I won't be able to use it. Okay, and that is why this is built as a promise, and it has to be resolved in a very specific way. And essentially, when we resolve a promise using .then, we only have access to the results of the promise within this construct over here. So within this callback function, this is where we can access the results. And I can't access the results over here outside of my promise. So I can't say console.log result because I don't have access to this result outside of the promise. Okay? And if I tried to do this, then I wouldn't even necessarily have the result because it may not have come back yet. So this, I hope that this kind of clarified a bit in retrospect a lot of the stuff that we've been doing. And if it hasn't yet, don't worry. It takes time for this concept of promises to sink in and a lot of practice. But I want to take this opportunity not only to explain the past, but also to show you another way for resolving promises that is even more common today. It's a rather new way of resolving promises, but people find it to be a lot cleaner and easier to use. And the reason I haven't used it until now is because the current Wix documentation is built using .then.catch, and I wanted you to be able to read and understand the Wix documentation. And it is still a legitimate way to resolve a promise, and there are even some situations where I choose to resolve promises in this way instead of the new way that I'm going to show you. So before I show you this new way to resolve promises, I want to highlight what the issue is that we're trying to solve. And that is that when I use this method for resolving a promise, if I want to use these results and resolve another promise, essentially I will have to have another layer, okay, within this .then, and then if I wanted to use these results over here to resolve another promise, then I would have to have another layer inside, and you can see how it's getting quite large. And this isn't such a crazy situation where I would need to use the results from one promise to resolve another promise. Just for example, if I got back these results.items, and then I wanted to say that I want to query another database for like we actually encountered this in when we were talking about query referenced. Okay, so I want to first get a result, and then I want to query a reference for another item in another collection, and then I want to do something else. So we create this situation where we have layers upon layers of .then and .catch, and you don't even know which catch is for which then, and it gets very complicated. So in order to solve this issue, JavaScript, the people in charge of JavaScript invented a new concept called async await. Okay, and this is another way to resolve promises by essentially using two keywords. So this other way of resolving promises requires the use of a function. Okay, and just to write it in comparison to what we have here, so if I was writing this same code using async await, I would write it as follows. So I would first create a function, and I'd call it query mock data. Okay, you can call the function whatever you want, of course. And inside of the function, I would write const result equals, and here I have to use a special keyword called await. And then I can add my query, so that would be Wix data dot query mock data dot find. And this keyword await works together with another keyword called async, and this async keyword needs to be put before the name of the function. Okay, so before we even use the function keyword, we have to write the word async. And here we use await before the promise, and then JavaScript essentially knows that we need to wait for the result of this to come back before we can use this result variable later on in our code. Okay, so then I can add here console.log result.items. And in order to have this run, all I would have to do is to run my query mock data function. Now, if you're quite sharp and you might be thinking, but wait, there's still something missing here that we were able to do with this .then that we're not able to do here yet with async await, and that is this catch. Okay, so in addition for just waiting for the results, we also had the option to catch if we had any problem getting the results at all. And the way that we deal with that when we're using async await is by using something called try catch. Okay, so essentially, so the catch keyword you're already familiar with. It's a little different here, so you'll see that the error is only in one set of parentheses instead of a callback function. And essentially what try catch does is it says try to do this and catch an error if there's an error and do something else. So I would have to take these two lines of code and put them here inside of the try, and then here inside the catch I could say console.log error. So essentially what's happening here is as follows. Our function will try to resolve this promise. Okay, it'll check if we have a result. If we have a result, then it will log the result and it will execute additional code. Okay, but if we have an error, then it'll go straight to the catch and it'll log the error and it will not run this additional code. Okay, so the second that we have an error inside of our try, we exit the try and we enter the catch. Okay, so that's one important thing to note about try catch. And initially it might look like we have essentially about the same amount, the same lines of code here and here. But the difference is that here within the same try, we can essentially use this result and await an additional promise. Okay, so I could say const result 2 equals to await wix data dot query mock data dot find. Whoops. Mock data dot find. Okay, and we can have as many promises like this one after the other. And we can even use this result inside of this promise. For example, if I wanted to say query mock data 2, it's a fake collection. I don't actually have a mock data 2 collection. And I say dot contains ID is the same as result dot, whoops, result dot items 0 dot ID. Okay, so I get a result back from one query, and then I say, okay, now query another collection that and find me an item that the ID of that item contains the same ID as the first result from my previous collection. Okay, just a very simple example. And you'll see here that I don't have to have that dot then and then another dot then within another dot then. Okay, so I can use several promises together one after the other in a much more concise and organized way. Okay, so this is a way of resolving promises that is becoming more and more prevalent. Our code is much cleaner, but it's important to be familiar with both methods, not only to think as .then.catch as the older, not relevant method, but just to think of it as two different approaches that you can take that might be good for different situations. So with that, I've covered, again, about 80% of what you need to know about resolving promises. We haven't really talked about how to create your own promise yet, because that is quite an advanced JavaScript concept from my perspective, and it's not so necessary for you in order to use Velo code and develop on Wix successfully. I do encourage you to go on by yourself and explore and learn about it. And there are some other nuances regarding promises that we haven't touched in this specific lesson, but this should be enough for you to both understand what we've been doing until now in terms of .then and .catch, and to make the transition to async await if you choose to do so. And from now on in the course, I will be going to use async await in order to practice that and give you a feel of what async await is like.